Gunalchish Kaski. And our next speaker is Dan Henry from Haines. Dan has been a teacher and has taught some of my children who are adults now. So, Gunalchish.
Gunalchish for having me today. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you very much, Marcia. When Marcia was talking this morning in her very eloquent way about her own family and using Tlingit language in her home, I was sitting there squirming in my seat because I was her kid's English teacher. All 4 kids. But then I hope I redeemed myself a few years later when Marcia and I worked together on a radio program called Tlingit Time, and it's still playing in Haines, and I think you can find that with the Alaska Humanities Forum as well. So it's around. Thanks again very much. On that idea of me being a teacher, I have to say that I am not an anthropologist. I am a rhetorician. And rhetoricians come at this from a very different point of view. Aristotle defined rhetoric as the art of using all available means to persuade. And so I study persuasion, and which is distinctly a Tlingit tradition, too. There's much persuasion and oratory in Tlingit culture, and I think that's probably been part of the draw that has taken me close to that. But also, as a teacher in Haines and living in Haines for 30 years, I continued to talk to my students, and I was always testing my students about what they knew about their Tlingit culture, because 25–30% of my students in my classes were Tlingit or related to Tlingit people or something. And while they might know a clan story or two, they really didn't know about the last 200 years of history. Maybe in their families, somewhat, but I was disturbed to know that they didn't know much, and they really couldn't tell you much. And so I made it my purpose to start working on information that would be available to my students who are now adults and their children and other people, because the story of the Chilkat and Chilkoot people in the Upper Lynn Canal is an amazing story. It also connects with many of the stories in Southeast Alaska. So that's what I'm working on. In the 80s, I had an opportunity to conduct oral histories with a number of the elders in the Haines area at that time, Austin Hammond and Richard and Mary King, Maria Miller, and I'm glad to see that Jay Miller is here today, David Andrews, Marilyn and Paul Wilson, on and on. So I learned a lot. I had to listen a lot. And oftentimes, Austin Hammond or others would say, turn off that recorder, just hear my words. And then they talk, and then 5 minutes later they say, now you repeat that. And I listened so hard that sometimes I got a headache, but I think that shows that your brain is working. Is there a little? There's a... Oh, there, I see. After working with the elders for quite a while, Dixie Johnson adopted me and gave me my adopted name, Shtuwaka, which is a big name, she said, and it's a big clan, Kagwantan, and you better live up to it. And I didn't really know the whole picture behind that at that time. And it has taken me a long time to come around to it. And then, as I started working on a history of the people in the Northern Lynn Canal and started getting into the life of Louis Shotridge, I had read quite a bit, and I had looked through his letters back at University of Pennsylvania, also in the mission school archives and other places around the country. I began to see the name only about 3 years ago, Shtuwuka. He was called many things. I saw in other books Situwuka or Setukwa or different things, but then I finally looked in the Dallenour's Life Histories book, and it was Shtuwuka, which just sent chills through me, because here I was deeply researching his life history, and I carried that same name as well. So what Dixie Johnson had told me and the admonition that she gave me with that was really coming around. I will be saying some things about Louis and Florence Shotridge that some of you may know, some of you have heard different versions, and that is perfectly acceptable. And if I am missing things or mispronouncing, or you think I might have a fact wrong or something, I'm happy to talk with you after the discussion, and please set me straight, because I'm still a student and I'm still learning this. I'll start off with just reading a little bit of the beginning to give you a sense of it. Some of you may not know who Louis Shotridge is, and I think most of you do. If you are interested in this paper, I have extra copies of the paper. I have 5 or 6 copies, and I have a digital copy as well. So anybody here who is perhaps related or really interested, come see me and I can hopefully get you a copy. So the title of this paper is New Indians, and I'm just going to read a little bit, and then I'll talk to you about some of the things, but I'll read from time to time too. In spring of 1923, Tlingit men and women of the Chilkat Valley conducted a referendum on the deeds of their most controversial member. For 7 troubled years, the man pressured Chilkat kinsmen to sell their best and oldest clan possessions to the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Some widows and heirs parted with their treasures for a few $100s. Others refused any offer. Especially resistant was Yathkok, Hitsati of the Whale House, Yehit, protector of the finest indigenous artwork on the West Coast. The Ganaktedi houseposts, rain screen, and feasting dish comprise the heart of Old Klukwan and the museum's primary objective. Their man would not be deterred from his mission, despite relatives who threatened that he remove the atu over their dead bodies. Seeking to thaw icy clan tensions, northern Tlingits turned to tools borrowed from American settlers. They voted. Ballot boxes were provided in the A&B, Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood halls of Klukwan and Haines, built only 6 or 7 years earlier. A letter dated April 22nd, 1923, from Shotridge to the museum told the outcome. The native population of Haines has voted against us, but the Klukwan majority appeared in our favor. But we have decided to ignore all community interest and proceed with our plan. And the plan, of course, was to acquire the Whale House Atu in Yehit. For 9 more years, the collector pursued the Whale House Masterworks, a campaign associated with such pain that some still refuse to utter his name. This is a touchy subject, as some of you who know this understand. And there are different sides to the story. I'm going to be looking at the early lives of these people and kind of show some of the influences that caused Louis Shotridge and Florence, his lovely wife, to work to acquire the artifacts in the Chilkat Valley and the Haines area. I'll talk about both of them, some of their early influences, their families. I won't really get into their later, more controversial lives, but I need to tell you, I think it's good to have a foundation of where they are coming from. But I wanted to start off with that to let you see how really controversial they were in the area that they were living in, and also their effect, nationwide. Born Scundoo'o in 1882 or 1883, the grandson of the great chief, and I'll say the anglicized Koh'klux, although I think it's Haatkwaax. Close? Marcia is my teacher. He was the first of his people to embrace and emulate the upper ranks of white society by becoming a renowned Native American anthropologist. He was likely the first anthropologist from Southeast Alaska among the Tlingit people. Curator, linguist, author, opera singer, hunting guide to Teddy Roosevelt, advisor to Franz Boas, Edward Sapir, and Alfred Kroeber. In the opening decades of the 20th century, Louis Shotridge was perceived as one of America's most civilized Indians. And in fact, his picture was on the cover of many magazines, showing him as a fully civilized man. This is him wearing, of course, materials that he acquired from the Chilkat Valley. He probably owned this aatkwaax, I assume. But there are also pictures, and I'll show you later, of him wearing Blackfoot Indian costumes, regalia, because him and his wife traveled around the country quite extensively in Blackfoot garb. You would wonder why, and perhaps I can explain to you a little bit. His work has been covered by many people. I want to acknowledge, of course, the Dowenauers, Richard and Nora, for their work on that. Maureen Milburn's dissertation, The Politics of Possession, and a number of other people who have written about Louis Shotridge and have researched him. In 1923, just after he had been voted out of Haines, he wrote to his supervisor in Pennsylvania. He said, "It is clear now that unless someone goes to work, records our history in the English language, and places these old things as evidence, the noble ideas of our forefathers shall be entirely lost." So he was very, very concerned about the loss of aatkwaax, of traditions, of the Tlingit way of life. His means by trying to preserve that, however, can be argued. So this paper will focus on his early looks and or his early actions, and as I said, I look at this as a rhetorician. So the debate about the ethics and acts of Louis Shotridge continues today. Most recently, materials, treasures were brought back to the Snail House in Hoona that Shotridge had acquired, and there were several comments about Shotridge that he might have been a good anthropologist, but he was lacking in qualities that needed to be a good Tlingit. Many people use that opportunity for debate back and forth, and because of that, I think it's important to kind of lay out some of the main parts of his life on that. So I'm looking at a rhetorical portrait, basically those things that influenced him, that caused him to be a persuader, and the response in his kinsmen and other Tlingit people to that kind of persuasion. He was employed by the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia at the museum. He was a curator there. The museum was founded in 1887 to get the great works of antiquity, which are there at the UP Museum from Greece, Egypt, China, Palestine, Africa, Guatemala, and the Amazon. And in their American wing, there is a large section devoted to Southeast Alaska, collected by Louis Shotridge. And there are over 400 items in there that were collected by him. By the way, when the Snail House items were returned to Hoona, Shotridge, that was just 2 years ago, Shotridge again was on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and there was a long article about him, and so he's still around, you know. In fact, he has a different sort of sense about him than perhaps he did in that time. So let's go back to his early times. And maybe you can hit that for me. I don't know if my pictures are in the right order, and they're not necessarily. So, well, we'll just stay here for a moment. This is an older picture, 1906, 1907, right in that period of the native section of Haines, Alaska. Of course, those of you who know the Raven House know that it's probably just the next house over. I think it's not in the picture, although I might be wrong about that. Neither Louis nor Florence Shotridge had ever ventured beyond Southeast Alaska until September 1905, when they traveled to the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in Portland, Oregon. In a visit to Haines Mission months earlier, Alaska Territorial Governor John Brady was struck by Florence's beauty and artistic skills, so selected her to represent Alaska as a Chilkat weaver at the fair. And this was really the World's Fair in Portland in 1905. And Louis, her husband of 3 years, accompanied her on the steamer voyage, and along with him he took several crates of Tlingit cultural materials for display and for sale. Some background on this, and I think what I'll do, since these pictures didn't come out in order, I'm going to talk a little bit and then we'll run through the pictures at the end to identify some of the things that I'm talking about. They drew many curious crowds to their booth in Portland at the 1905 exposition. And they were continually telling people their background, introducing their family, and that sort of thing. Louis was Shtubuka, meaning astute one. He was born in Klukwan in the Kagwantan clan of his mother, Kudaitsakwa. His father was Ganakti Yeti from Gooch Hit, Wolf House, son of Yehuksu, or George Shotridge. George Shotridge was the son of Koh'klux, Kaaláx. Closer. Thank you. His wife was Florence Dennis Shotridge, called Kaaláx in Tlingit. She was born in Chilkoot. She's Lukakati on her mother's side, Kagwantan Yeti from her father. Her father, it is controversial, it's unclear, although in her obituaries, including the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer, her father was known as Scundoo'o, Scundoo'o, who was a very famous Ikt shaman in the area, but that's still up in the air. In fact, she called herself Susie Scundoo'o. So it's a lot of things point to her being that way, although I've looked in the census records, and in the 1900 census records, Scanda Whoo and his wife had one child. Her name was Mary. And then when I asked his last living relative, Charlie Brulette, just a few years ago, he'd never heard of Mary, but he did know about Florence, and he said that she was a very high-flown, high, fancy woman, he said, who went back east. At the exposition, George Byron Gordon met the Shotridges, and he just happened to be there at the exposition. He was the head curator for the American wing of the UP Museum. He met them. He was immediately drawn to them. Louis Shotridge took him over to his items for sale. He bought many items. I think he bought 48 items. He called them curios. He sold them copper daggers, smoking pipes, women's dancing headdresses. So they immediately became associates at that point. And then Gordon began to write him letters saying, where can we get more of this? And by the time that Florence and Louis Shotridge were back up in Haines, he was getting letters from Gordon, and he responded, and this is, now we've gone back to 1906, he responded, I start now getting some of the things you want. Most of them are very hard to get. I would have to go 25 miles up the river to a place called Koh'klux in the Chilkat River for them, because all the best things are up there. I will do my very best to make a good collection. I will try to get everything as cheaply as I can, but I can't get them for no less than the others are paying for. So you had this relationship going on between Shotridge and George Gordon. The letters, if you look at them, and by the way, all of the letters between Gordon and Shotridge are now online. They have been digitized, and if you go to the University of Pennsylvania Museum website, you can find all of these letters. And to look at all of the letters shows you a very intense relationship between a Tlingit man who is driven to save the items of his culture, and his boss back east, who is always drumming ahead. You must get them. You must get them as quickly as possible. You must get them for as cheaply as possible. That sort of thing. So there was quite a bit of tension involved in that. And so I encourage people to look at those letters if you have a chance to do that. A few things about Florence Shotridge. As I said, she was born about the same time as Louis Shotridge, 1882, 1883. They were pledged at birth, and so they knew they were going to be married to each other. They got married in 1902 in Haines, and Shotridge built a house, which is in downtown Haines, just up the hill from the old native section of town. And Florence was quite a beautiful person, and I'll show you here. In fact, Louis Shotridge, his style was somewhat brusque and abrupt. He was a real negotiator, but he stayed with his price. His wife, Florence, was really, in many ways, and in the letters and in Gordon's opinion, she was the diplomat. She was the one who kind of smoothed the waters, who allowed Shotridge to make some of his sales and that sort of thing. Early correspondence to Gordon from Alaska hardly restrained the enthusiasm of a young man on the verge of realizing his ambitions. Just after the World's Fair, he wrote, "It won't take many months to get through collecting. We all think it's better for you in all circumstances to have me collect the best and oldest of things, for I would know how to get them and where to get them. I will go get from Koh'klux now 8 totem poles, only the best and oldest that they are. They belong to the inside 4 corners of the largest houses. And then there's a large wall for the inside also, and a long, large dish hewed out like an immense worm." Of course, the woodworm that people in Klawock know, the Ganaktedi. "All of these have the best history, and they are the very oldest there is. There are many other things besides that are easy to get." And this is a young man of his mid-20s. Louis Shotridge is continually trying to encourage the University of Pennsylvania, and he's trying to make his best show for them. As it turns out, however, many of his kinsmen rejected that very much. In fact, I would say that most of them did. When I was back east the number of times looking into his archives, however, he did keep assiduous records of every sale. And perhaps some of you have been back there and you have seen the bills of sale and the certificates with the names on them. And oftentimes, there were 3 names on some of those. Oftentimes, the 3rd name was the local missionary or clergyman who was there, and the name of the person who was selling the item was somebody who was forsaking his culture because he was becoming a Christian at that time. And so Shotridge, of course, spoke Tlingit. He knew the social situation and the politics in the villages, and so he knew who was doing what and who was possibly available to be a seller. a little bit more about Florence here, and I'm sorry I'm skipping around, and I'm about done with this, and I'll show you some pictures and I'll be done. She was also an excellent writer. And I would encourage anybody to look into the writings of Louis and Florence Shotridge. Florence, unfortunately, died in 1917 in the Great Influenza epidemic. But in the time before that, she had written some very interesting pieces about her weaving. She was a Chilkat blanket weaver. She wrote about the woman who married the bear, that story, which was part of her husband's clan, the Kagwantan, and she wrote in a very clean, clear way. Portions of her paper about that were used in an article she co-wrote with Louis in 1913, UP Museum Journal, called The Indians of the Northwest. A more personal account of Tlingit culture, the life of a Chilkat Indian girl, also appeared in the issue. Her writings and appearances drew the admiration of adults, but the entranced school children of Philadelphia loved their museum guide, who they called her the Indian princess. And when she passed away, many of the obituaries said America's Minnehaha. You can see that perhaps they were trying to honor her, but at the same time, it was a time when the racism at the time escaped them. And in fact, well, it was a whole different thing, of course. I'm going to leave that right there at this moment and show you some pictures and just say a couple of things about that before Marcia comes on. And yeah, if you just want to go through them, that'd be great. So this is a picture that of a funeral procession right during the influenza, 1917, 1918, and I wanted to throw that out there because when Florence died, reputedly there was a funeral procession from Haines all the way out to Chilkoot Lake, 9 miles long. It was reported in newspapers all over the country, and now her grave is quite a big production. Now it is lost and forgotten. I go out there 2 or 3 times a year, and many people don't know where it is. Probably some of you have been there to Chilkoot. It's not lost, but it's lost in lore. Many people don't know where it is. And I was reminded of that this morning when Bob Sam was talking about the cemeteries. So there you have a funeral procession. Let's go a little further. And these are just pictures from around. This is a photograph from Louis Shotridge. His photographs, as some of you know, are unique in historic work because the people he's photographing look more comfortable. They don't look as stiff and formal sometimes, because here was the photographer speaking Tlingit, and here were his Tlingit subjects, and they look more relaxed, I think. This is the Shotridge House today in Haines, and Dwight and Nancy Nash live there, and there's been a ceremony recognizing it. I think it ought to be on the National Register, but it's not at this point. And that is the Shotridge House shortly after Shotridge built it in the earlier part of the 20th century. This is a famous picture some of you have seen, and there were different versions of this picture. This is Scanda Whoo, the last major shaman from Yandastukye. There were other Icht around. Scunda Whoo was also known as Sheriff Scunda Whoo. When he was sent to San Quentin for the murder of a woman for 3 years through his ceremonies. And when he came back from San Quentin, he had converted to Salvationism, and people knew him as Sheriff Scundoo'o, and he was downtown in Haines telling stories. And those are his 2 brothers. They're also significant, important people. I don't have time to talk about them right now. So And here's a fish trap up on the Chilkoot River, just to give you a sense of that. I wanted to get a little bit more into some of the fishing and the politics because Shotridge was involved with that a bit, but there's no time for that, so we'll keep moving on. And yeah, this got in there. I was going to mention it again, but we can keep going through here. Oh, that's it? Okay. So I'm going to end right here with that, but this is only the beginning of a longer story. And Louis Shotridge finally had been a curator at UP, and in 1916, he returned to Haines with his mission, and that was to bring the best and oldest things back to Pennsylvania. And that was a 20-year campaign, essentially, in which he worked very hard to bring certain things back. Some things he did. He did not bring back the whale house. And in his letters, there is a very long letter to his boss at University of Pennsylvania describing in depth his speech to Aatkwaax and the people of the whale house, the Gunnak-Tedi, trying to persuade them to allow him to take the items. And it is about a 10-page letter typed, single-spaced, in which he tries every way possible to do that. And then there is a short speech at the end, which is Aatkwaax's response. Aatkwaax was an elderly man at the time, and he had his nephews around him, and essentially he said, what you talk about is a very heavy thing. These are objects of great weight, and because I'm an old man like now, I don't feel like I can really make this sort of decision, so I'm going to leave it up to my nephews. And the nephews did not like Shotridge at all, and so that was an easy way of saying, forget about it, buddy. But it went on. Shotridge went to Sitka then, but he made several trips back to Haines to try to acquire them. But I think it's time now to open up a discussion just among Tlingits and among anthropologists and among museum people to look at the value of these items. And I'll just leave you a little thought. And I'm not trying to say one way or the other, neither a hero nor a devil, but I do remember just 4 or 5 years ago, maybe it was 6 years ago now, in Klukwan, when they were dedicating the tribal house out there, the Longhouse. Smitty Katsik got up, and there was a repatriation from the Denver Museum. He was getting a hairpiece back that his mother had made, and he was talking about how complete it made him feel. And then he said something that really was a reference to Shotridge. He said, there was a man a while ago who took many things from our village, but he left little breadcrumbs for us to find them. And now they are coming back. I'll leave you with that thought, and I'd be happy to talk to people or give you a copy of the paper, which is much more complete than my talk. But thank you. Go next, Sheesh.